Enterprise presents the 40 Under 40 honorees in social justice activism, featuring organizers, advocates, and change agents. Angelo Pinto, Senior Strategist of Justice NYC and co-founder of Until Freedom. Brittany Packnett Cunningham, founder and principal of Love and Power Works and co-founder of Campaign Zero. Chloe Cheyenne Rogers, founder of Community X. Jeray McKeeson, co-founder of Campaign Zero. And Patrice Kahn Colors, author, activist, and co-founder of Black Lives Matter. For more information on all of our honorees, log on to blackenterprise.com/40 under 40.
Folks, I am so excited to moderate this conversation for Black Enterprise, the journey to justice from protest to policy, with this amazing panel. Introducing Angelo Pinto, who is a lawyer and a human rights activist and founding member and senior strategist for Justice League New York City and co-founder of Until Freedom, a civil rights organization dedicated to addressing systemic and racial justice. Also joining the panel today is Brittany Packnett Cunningham, who is a leader at the intersection of culture, justice, and policy. She serves as an NBC and MSNBC contributor and host of Undistracted, a podcast that looks at news and justice. And then finally, we have Mayor Tishaura Jones, mayor of St. Louis, Missouri, and who has been elected in 2012 with a series of firsts for that state. Welcome, everyone. I want to start off and jump right in to a pressure point that we are headed towards. In just a couple of days, we will visit the first anniversary of the death of George Floyd. We just lived through one of the most historic and, dare I say, trauma-induced trials of the century with the conviction of Derek Chauvin. Mayor, I want to start with you. What reflections do you have of the past year, what we learned through the uprisings in the summer of 2020, and where you think we need to be headed right now?
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I felt oftentimes as I was involved in the protest last summer with my son and my father that this time just felt different. That there were a whole host of people involved this time that weren't involved when Brittany and I were in the streets in 2014 in Ferguson. That because so many people saw George Floyd's death as it was happening, they saw the over 8 minutes that Derek Chauvin put his knee on George Floyd's neck and refused to get up despite his pleas to breathe or his pleas for his mother, that I just felt like everybody felt his pain and felt that that this time, this moment was going to be one of those moments that changed our moment into a movement. Because we thought that in 2014, but I think that this time with everyone being home and in front of their devices, in front of their TVs, and they could not turn away from it no matter what they did, that it moved a lot of people to move. I remember seeing text messages from my mom's squad, a group of white women that my son goes to school with, and they were telling me, when are we meeting? I got signs. What time are we meeting up? They were before I could even say anything. And so I knew that if this was happening in white suburban communities, that we had a chance to actually take this moment and turn it into a movement and actually see some real transformative change.
Brittany, you've been on the ground at so many movements, at so many points of flashpoints in our country, from Ferguson to George Floyd, and my God, the countless names in between. How do you think that this moment, May 25th, 2020 was different than what you experienced in Ferguson and before?
Well, I think part of what my hometown mayor, Mayor Jones, said is so critically important here, that there was a buildup, right? And really, the freedom struggle of Black people in this country has been occurring since the very first ship came to the dock, right? So this is a generations long, protracted struggle. This latest chapter, the last 6, 7, 8 years, has been a critical training ground for people to know what to do and how to get ready for this moment. I want to be very clear that we're having these conversations and we're having these flashpoints and we're having these movements because the Floyds lost their loved one, because a daughter lost her father, because parents lost their son. As you already said, there are so many families who have that same story. So it has cost our community entire lives just for the attitude of the country to begin to shift even just a bit. And that comes after 6 or 7 years of nonstop storytelling, protest, organizing, art, writing, elections. That is the kind of culture shift. That is how long it can take for that culture shift to happen, so that when a 9-minute video comes out, where Derek Chauvin has his knee in the neck of George Floyd and his fellow officers not only do nothing to stop it, but participate in George's murder and dehumanization, people are finally awake enough after all of that to see themselves and to recognize their complacency has been part of the problem the entire time. So I think that part of what was different about it is that there has been a crescendo, if you will, over the last several years, from Ferguson to New York to Baltimore to Cleveland to Florida to California, and so many places in between, where folks have recognized, I do not get to choose cowardice in this moment, because it could be me next time, right? And if we are going to get to the place where it's not just taking an officer to jail, but it's actually preventing our deaths in the first place and allowing Black folks to have thriving lives, because that's true justice, then it's gonna take all of us working on this. It's gonna take Black folks, it's gonna take white folks, it's gonna take non-Black people of color, it's gonna take wealthy folks, it's gonna take working class folks, it's gonna take corporate folks, it's gonna take academics, it's gonna take pastors and rabbis and imams, it's going to take grandmothers and grandfathers, it's going to take people of all gender identities. None of us are free until all of us are free, and we can't get free if we don't get there together.
You know, Angelo, what I think struck me and what both the mayor and Brittany have said is we all watched that video, right? Because of the global health pandemic that we are living in, many of us have been home for a long time, and what would usually be a distraction had been removed. At the same time, even though we all witnessed this video, I think that as a nation, we were collectively holding our breath, waiting to see the outcome of this trial, right? Waiting, even after video, all these angles, right, that were given, we were still unsure of whether or not a Black man murdered by a white cop would be receiving justice. As an attorney, walk us through what you were thinking during this time as you were watching this, and whether or not there was going to be a strong enough case for us to finally, this one time, receive any semblance of justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me and for so many folks, so much has yet to change in this country. So even, when I first was thinking about the trial that would ensue, I didn't have much hope. I didn't have much faith. I knew that there was a different set of circumstances that would likely bring a different verdict because of the profile and visibility of the Floyd case. I knew that many individuals would be thinking that everything would have to happen, all stops would have to be pulled in order to try to convict Derek Chauvin of murdering George Floyd. I think the challenge is that we all witnessed George Floyd being murdered on tape. And the best we could get, the best the country could get, the best Black folks could get, the best the Floyd family can get was a difficult trial, where folks
Mm-hmm.
weren't sure what would happen. And I think for most folks today, even though, the verdict was guilty, 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 many still feel that justice wasn't served. And I think a lot of folks are beginning to look at even guilty verdicts as just one small step in accountability towards the road of justice. I don't think we are yet experiencing justice. I think justice for many folks would be, of course, these incidents, police murder not happening in the first place, folks not having to deal with excessive force and police brutality. So I think that the case really epitomized a variety of things. I think it epitomized where Black folks still are in this country, where the system of justice often doesn't serve us any justice, but even the ways in which justice rolls out is insufficient in this current moment. It's a small moment. It's a small piece of accountability in the ways in which we are trying to shift and I think transform the systems of justice and the systems of policing to really be honorable to Black folks. So I think we're in a different moment where a guilty verdict alone isn't enough, but we're trying to really push forward the kinds of policy and the kind of change that will make Black folks have some confidence in the system and some confidence that justice is beginning to happen.
Now, Mayor, to Angelo's point about justice versus accountability, mayors across this country have been under lots of pressure, right? From dealing with, again, the global health pandemic that we're still working our way through, as well as the conversation around defunding the police and whether or not we can reimagine policing from its origins as slave catchers to the fact that the Derek Chauvins of the world can't be trained out of racism, right? You can't train somebody out of the kind of hate and cruelty and viciousness that we've all witnessed. And we know that this is not a bad apple, that Derek Chauvin is but one apple from a poisonous orchard that blankets this entire country. When it comes to conversations around defunding the police, where do you think that we need to go? And is that language, even that moniker of defund the police as opposed to reallocation, right? The right conversation to be having?
Yes, absolutely. And I've been dealing with that recently as I have, we're in the middle of budget season. And I recently took $4 million from open positions and put money towards affordable housing, towards victim support services, and increasing the number of social workers employed by the city. Because for me, the language that I use is transforming public safety. How can we use this moment and use this money to transform public safety, to put the public back in public safety, to make sure that people are safe in their neighborhoods and their homes? How do we invest in prevention instead of in this old, tired arrest and incarcerate model that isn't keeping anyone safe? We have been funding this same method of criminal justice or injustice for several decades, and we're not safer as a result. So we have to do something different, because doing the same thing over and over and over again is the definition of insanity. And nobody has time for that, especially if you're asking mayors to stop the violence, to invest in things that are going to curb violence in our communities. We can't do it by just throwing more money at the same old policing strategies. We have to do something new and different.
Brittany, to the mayor's point, do you think that we are ready for something different, right? Because we hit these inflection points. We hit these moments, and to your earlier point of this being a crescendo, right? But then we get hung up on language. We get hung up on linguistics. Oh, should we defund the police? And so we start having conversations about the phrase as opposed to the policing, the policing, right? And what it means to be safe. So how do we move from the conversation around language to actually looking at what people are faced with in their day-to-day lives?
I mean, you ask, are we ready? I say, ask the family of Breonna Taylor if we have to be ready. Ask Ma'Khia Bryant's family if we have to be ready. Ask Daunte Wright's family if we have to be ready. This is why I constantly come back to the cost, because the cost is lives. The cost is safety. The cost is security. The cost is psychological protection. The cost is actual public safety, to Mayor Jones's point. So whether or not people are hung up on the language, whether or not everybody's ready to get on the train has got to move. This is literally a life or death conversation for us. And to your point, we have to recognize that even just last year, when there were rare trials of police officers who had killed people, not just Black people, people would use the phrase justice has been served. Now, all these years later, some folks like myself and many others who have been beating this clear drum that justice and accountability are not the same thing, that justice is Black folks thriving and accountability is the current system of incarceration actually catching police officers literally less than 1% of the time. That differentiation, that nuance was not being discussed in 2014 and 2015. It wasn't even being discussed that much in 2019 and 2020. So we are capable of moving conversations. We are capable of moving the cultural zeitgeist. And when we move the cultural zeitgeist, we move the mindsets of the people in charge, or we move the people in charge. So I don't want to miss what Mayor Jones said. Less than a month or two in office, she's already reallocated $4 million. We've got a lot of people talking about whether or not the political will exists to reallocate, defund, reimagine, however, transform, however you want to describe it. There are a lot of people still arguing, to your point, Danielle, about the words and whether or not it can happen. Well, it'll be too hard. These people won't like me. I won't get reelected. These donors won't like it. And while these people are wringing their hands, Mayor Jones is over here doing it, right? So if the people that we have elected are not going to have the courage, then we have to have the courage to elect new people. We have to actually make this system move toward us instead of us constantly adjusting to a system that constantly tells us to wait. And to paraphrase Dr. King, almost always means never. So whether or not the institutions are ready really isn't my concern. The people are ready. The people are ready to stop dying. And we have to be courageous enough and bold enough to use whatever platform and power we have in the corporate space, in the media space, in the political space, in the organizing space, in education, wherever you are. We have to require of ourselves that we tell the truth out loud and in public, that we push our institutions to be responsible with their budgets, with their hiring, with their values, and with their public expression of those values. And we have to make sure that we're the kind of people who can look back one day and say, I was on the right side of history. I chose justice, and I chose not to make people feel comfortable, but I chose to do what was right, just like Mayor Jones has done.
I couldn't agree more, because I think that what we constantly get stuck in is the people's comfort, right? And not the people, not the community, but those that we elect to be in charge. And we keep making compromises on the backs of Black and Brown communities and other marginalized communities, thinking that we are going to get someplace. Angelo, right now, we see many pieces of legislation that is working and being introduced in our Congress and by the new administration. One of them is the George Floyd police reform bill, right? But we're having, again, this compromise with regard to whether or not we include qualified immunity, whether we take it out, whether we keep putting bandages on broken legs. And I'm curious, your thoughts on, if we do not move that legislation forward with teeth, then does it matter?
Yeah. I mean, I think some things are not a compromise. I think if you miss certain pieces, I think if qualified immunity is removed, you lose the integrity of the legislation, and you no longer are dealing with a piece of legislation that is meaningful and transformative in what folks are asking for. I think many folks have any hope in police reform, police transformation, because folks were talking about ending qualified immunity. So I think if you remove that from the equation, you're dealing with a piece of legislation that does some things, but from my perspective, you just lose the true integrity of the moment. You lose the true integrity of what people want. And I think the reality of the matter is, it's not just an issue of policy. I think it's also an issue of the leaders who are in position to make a difference. and what kind of leadership we have pushing policy forward and being willing to not compromise. I think we have a lot of elected officials, a lot of folks in office who are willing to compromise too much.
Mm-hmm.
Often comes at the expense of policy, which means it comes at the expense of the people who'd like to see those changes. So we have to come to a place where we're not willing to compromise. I think our mantra has been for 2021 that we do need something different, but I think we need something different across the board. I think it has to happen with respect to policy. It has to happen with respect to leadership. And I think it also has to happen with respect to our inability, our unwillingness to compromise from positions that we know are going to be transformative. So I think that's just where we are in a historical moment where folks are saying it's not enough to gut a piece of legislation and still call it meaningful. We
Mm-hmm.
just need something different across the board.
You know, Brittany, one of the things that I think about often is the fact that when we see these moments, these flashpoints, millions of people marched around the globe, right, after witnessing the murder of George Floyd. We saw protests for the first time in our history in all 50 states, right? Not to mention, you know, other countries outside of the US. We use these moments as a motivating force to keep attention, right? How do we do that when now the trial is done? The trial of Derek Chauvin is finished. We are waiting on the sentencing. We're waiting on the trial of the other 3 officers, but that has now been pushed back, right? Now America is apparently back to being open again, and so attention is going to be swayed, right, from where attention has been. How do we continue the call? How do we continue the momentum when the dynamics around us change?
Yeah, this is a critical question for 2 reasons. One, because it acknowledges that this requires long-term work, that the amount of time that it takes for people to wake up, the amount of time that it takes for people to be engaged and finally use their voice pales in comparison to the amount of time that it actually takes to create lasting transformation that is felt in the material experiences of Black and other marginalized people. That until we get to the point where not only are the police not killing anyone, let alone disproportionately, but we're actually getting to the point where the violence enacted on Black people and marginalized folks' lives in all of these other systems doesn't exist, and we're actually able to thrive, that's when we can kick up our heels and say, well, we've done all of our work, right? But until then, there's plenty of work to do. So it's an important question because A, it acknowledges that we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Mm-hmm. B, though, it acknowledges that most of that work is not sexy. That most of that work is not going to be out in front of a camera. It is not even going to be out in the middle of the street. Much of that work is tactical, it is disciplined, it is strategic. A lot of that work is deeply local, and it's not going to necessarily happen on the same stages as the stages of our protest. So, you know, I love my hometown, as is very clear. I'm going to keep using St. Louis as an example. When you look at the work of organizations like Action St. Louis, when you look at organizers like Kayla Reed and preachers like Michelle Higgins and Tracy Blackman and Starsky Wilson, when you recognize all of these folks who have in small and large ways used whatever gifts and talents they have to move the needle on what matters locally, then you're able to help close jails like the workhouse that Mayor Jones has been pushing for. You're able to move budgets like we just talked about. You're also able to work to expand healthcare because, like I talk about, violence shows up in our lives, not just when we're dealing with policing, right? You're able to register hundreds of thousands of Black voters who had previously been disengaged from the electoral system, not because they were apathetic, but because nobody bothered to knock on their door. Nobody bothered to treat them like they matter. So when all of a sudden those folks were reminded, hey, you matter, they were able to elect and re-elect different folks, not just in the mayor, but also in the circuit attorney, in the St. Louis County prosecuting attorney, because those roles matter. The treasurer's office, those roles matter as well. And then those folks are also coming back and saying, you knocked on my door. Now I want to go sign up to knock on somebody else's door. Now I want to go canvass and help expand power and base building in my community. So that's the kind of work it's going to take for us to keep this thing going. If you're looking for the sexy thing, if you're looking for the thing that brings fame and fortune, I'm here to tell you this is not the work
This
you
ain't
should
it.
choose. If you are here because you think that this is popular, you know, I will remind you that everybody who is on this call right now has been called everything but a child of God for simply standing up and doing the right thing and saying what needs to be said and using our platforms and our power for the things that matter. So if you're in it because you want to feel good about yourself, make a different choice. But if you're in it because you want to see our people be free, because you know, if our folks are free, everybody will be free, then come, in the words of Lilla Watson, let us work together, right? Let us realize that even if it is that small act of joining your local organization that's fighting police violence, that's fighting environmental racism, that's fighting gun violence, that's fighting economic injustice, when you show up, when you give your money, when you give your time, when you give your talent, when you give your treasure, all of those things are help moving the needle. And if while you're doing that, you recruit some other people to join you, then we can build the biggest, baddest movement that this world has ever seen for our collective freedom, and we can get further, faster together.
Mayor, you know, there is so much, to Brittany's point, so much that will be on our plate, so much that we are headed into as we climb our way towards justice, right? It's each generation's work, right, to move us further and further towards that arc. What is your hope for your city, and your city being a model for other cities, and how they engage community, how they build community, and how they hold those that are supposed to protect them accountable?
Yeah, so I want to start by saying, you know, Brittany just said everything and we can all go home. But she's right. This work is not sexy. The organizing it's messy too, because a lot of people call me the people's mayor, and being the people's mayor requires getting in and listening to the people, no matter if their opinion of you is good, bad, or indifferent. And that's the work that I'm committed to doing during this entire process. Case in point, my third or fourth day on the job, we had a public hearing to talk about the budget and where people's priorities would like to see the budget go. And we had a whole host of testimony about people asking to put more money in affordable housing and put more money in victim services, and taking money out of oppressive structures and systems in our government. And so I worked with the comptroller, and we were able to find money to fund the things that people talked about on that call. So it's about being responsive to the people. We haven't had that sort of engagement and also response from our local government in decades. And so, you know, while the people who were advocating for that change applauded it, I had a whole host of other people who didn't like what I did. But again, you know, people are dying in these streets every day, every weekend, because unfortunately, St. Louis is known as one of the most violent cities in America, not only because of the gun violence in our streets, but also because of the police violence. We have the unfortunate designation of having the most police-involved shootings of any American city in the country. And so I am fighting two battles at the same time. Yeah. And in order to do that, it's a messy process of staying engaged and staying involved, and not only at election time. So we're putting together a survey right now about all of this federal money that's coming to the city and how we can spend it for good and not evil, how we can use it to make investments in communities that haven't seen investment in decades, and make sure that the investments that we make today with these federal funds, that we see returns for many, many years to come, because we can't just blow this opportunity. This is an unprecedented opportunity to do some real work and make some real investments in people that have been marginalized and flat out left out for far too long.
Angelo, I'll give you the last word here. What does freedom look like? What does, I mean, and that's big, I saw your eyes, but what does freedom look like for us when the work seems continuous, when it seems unrelenting, when it seems never ending?
Yeah, I think freedom, I think my understanding, my definition of freedom is constantly evolving. It's constantly evolved since I've done the work. And for me, I think it should constantly evolve. But I think what it means for me is for Black folks and other oppressed folks to really have agency to decide what they want their lives to look like, to have control over the government and the systems that are impacting their life, and to be able to say if a system isn't working, if an institution isn't working for them, it should cease to exist or it should radically be transformed. I think freedom is your ability to decide, the
Mm.
power to determine what your future looks like, what your tomorrow looks like, and what your today looks like and feels like. So I think that's what folks are really asking for. Folks are saying that this doesn't feel right. This isn't right. This is oppressive. We want this to end. Let's do this now. And you hear from other folks their unwillingness to do it. Some of it's because folks are benefiting a great deal off of the oppression of others, and some of it is because some folks just don't have the real lived experience of others. So I think freedom really means having the power to decide what you want your life to be like and to feel like, to look like, and your interactions with other systems that might influence you. So for me, freedom is
Mhm.
really the power to decide, and the power to influence those who may not choose what you want for yourself, and being able to move them along or move them out of the way.
I just want to thank each and every single one of you for your work, for your commitment to this work, to our community, and to justice in this country that didn't want us. But we are here, and each and every day they try and make us feel as if we don't belong. But you remind us each and every day that we do. Angelo, Pinto, Mayor Jones, Brittany, Packnett, Cunningham, thank you so very much for making the time to join us today.